It gives me extreme pleasure to welcome you to this Center for Global Finance Research Seminar today on the 14th of June. As it happens, this is the last seminar this academic year, 2022-2023. And the next seminar will be next academic year. We'll actually start on the 27th of September 2023 and continue right into 2024. And for this seminar on extremely interesting topic of financialization of non-financial corporations in South Africa, we are extremely delighted to have as the speaker for this session, Professor Antonio Andreoni, who is one of us here at SOAS, University of London. Antonio is very well known to most people in the audience here, but it's always an honor to introduce Antonio, and also to acknowledge the role he's playing now as the head of research and knowledge exchange for the college of our college, CODEF, which is the College for Development, Economics and Finance here at SOAS, University of London. And especially the tradition is that the first seminar in the series is run by myself, just to fire off the first seminar. And it's just very pleasing to see that the final seminar is done by our head of the college research and knowledge exchange group function. But Antonio, just to give him the full, to introduce him fully, he is also the Professor of Development Economics in the Department of Economics here at SOAS, University of London. But actually, he has a wide and important footprint in terms of a networking with many universities in a functional form, because he's a visiting professor at the Southern African Research Chair in Industrial Development at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa. Also, honorary professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, the University College London, UCL next door, and also a fellow of the DG GROW of the European Commission. So we have a leading authority here who also has published prolifically and extensively in areas such as technological change and digitalization, structural transformation and energy transition, institutional change and political economic development, financialization and corporate governance, industrial policy and competition policy. I put industrial policy because it's so interesting that industrial policy is now at the forefront of economic science. And so we're delighted that we do have our leading expert here, Antonio, leading on this front here at the SOAS University of London. And his research has appeared in many top-rated journals, the Cambridge Journal of Economics, Structural Change and Economic Dynamics, Technovation, Oxford Review of Economic Policy, Development and Change, Energy Policy, Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy and Society, all the journals that we all aspire to publish in. And Antonio has already led the way in breaking through to these mainstream journals. But not only in journal articles, but also in some leading cutting-edge books, including the recent one, quite recently, the book Structural Transformation in South Africa by Oxford University Press in 2021. And also a relevant book last year, relevant for this topic, today, which reads From Financialization to Innovation in UK Big Pharma. Also from Cambridge University Press, 2022. In addition to many other scholarly roles, he plays as a leader in our profession by co-editing the European Journal of Development Research, which is one of my favorite journals, actually. So that's very, very great that you are leading on this one. And for over a decade now, Antonio has been at the forefront of knowledge exchange. That's component of his work by working with several multilateral organizations, including UNIDO, UNCTAD, ILO, UNDP, World Bank, OECD, and of course, national governments in industry, including South Africa, Chile, Mauritius, Tanzania, and Uganda. So we do have today, we are very fortunate to have, Antonio, leading expert in his field, to share his great work with us. But we're also very delighted to have with us Antonio co-author, Sophie van Huellen, who until recently was one of us in SOAS, but actually is building a bridge between SOAS and University of Manchester. And we're so delighted to have so many friends, collaborators, policymakers in the audience today. So it's now a great pleasure to all put our hands together and welcome Antonio to present his research to us. Antonio.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you very much. This is an extremely generous presentation. I'm very honored and pleased to be here to see also lots of colleagues, friends who are working in very relevant and related topics. So it's really an opportunity to present some work that I've been doing as part of a broader research agenda, which I will try to sketch in the seminar. And this specific paper came out as a spin-out from a project that Victor kindly mentioned, which was a project with the Department for Trade, Industry and Competition, the DTIC in South Africa, which funded for several years a group of us working on industrial policy, industrial development, structural transformation. This work developed also partially also here at SOAS with one of our former students who is now working at TIPS in South Africa. We can see Nishal is also in the audience. So I'm actually going to present, but I'm pleased that my co-authors are here and they can also contribute later in the discussion. Now, as Victor mentioned, I come to the topic of financialization from a quite specific point of view, as someone interested in understanding dynamic of structural transformation from the point of view of productive organization, the articulation of this productive organization along value chains, and the way in which finance and financialization processes within these organizations impact the extent to which, especially in countries where investment are much needed, impact the dynamics of productive investment. So this is why the topic is about financialization of non-financial corporation in South Africa. And what we try to do in this paper, which is available on the, one second, the slide should be moving, yes, on the SOAS working paper series, we try to actually start developing a framework that allows to assess and understand, disentangle the way in which financialization work in the context of a middle-income country, which has struggled to more than others to actually transform its productive basis. And all those of you, and I see quite a few in the audience working in South Africa, this is a country with an enormous potential, but since this post-apartheid period, lots of this potential and lots of the industrial policy that have been put in place to promote industrialization and structural transformation have had mixed results, to the point that at the moment the country is struggling with a dramatic energy crisis. Despite all that, South Africa is one of the countries definitely in the African continent, but in the global South, which has developed more than others its financial sector. And also is a country which developed its corporate governance regulations, taking inspiration from the Anglo-Saxon type of corporate governance world, probably more from the US than the UK. And this is going to matter in the discussion later on, because lots of the work we are trying to do is to understand really how financialization works in this context. We know a lot about how financialization is played out in the context of the US, the work that William Lazzonic and others have done, Panirin, Mary O'Sullivan and others have done over the last 20, 30 years in this space, also in the UK in specific sector, has highlighted specific patterns of financialization. And our attempt is to try to move that kind of work forward by focusing on a specific middle-income country context with specific structural characteristics, a different institutional political economy setting, and even more importantly, different type of dynamics of capitalist accumulation, innovation, and rents generation in these countries. And you can also see that we emphasize the fact that we are not just looking at corporations, but we are looking at how corporations, with their financialization, can impact the rest of their supply chain. So we try to, as you see in the paper, to focus on different type of companies who are playing different type of roles in their respective value chain. So we try to do quite a lot of things in this paper. It's a more seminal piece of work, which spin out, as I said, from this book, where we had the first attempt at looking at a number of cases with the same co-authors. And in fact, what we were trying to do was to say, well, let's try to address this fundamental puzzle. South Africa is a country where profitability is not low, but actually investment are among the lowest in all the middle-income countries comparators that we used in the book, the traditional Brazil, Malaysia, Thailand, and others. So what is happening in this context? And our hypothesis was that actually something fundamental is happening at the level of corporation and key corporations in the non-financial corporation in the economy, and therefore the need to try to understand internal dynamic of financialization in this context. Before I start with the paper, let me also emphasize one issue: that financialization in the context of South Africa, we enter into the topic from the point of view, as I said, of looking at industrial policy, looking at structural transformation. And of course, the question was always, is industrial policy sufficiently targeted, sufficiently capable to unlock these productive opportunities and also create a compulsion for investment? It's interesting that now, where industrial policies are becoming, there is eternal return of industrial policy, they never disappear, but we always seem to rediscover industrial policy at each crisis. It's becoming very interesting how also in the US, you start having a discussion around industrial policy, but the industrial policy is not linked to financialization of the experience of that country. Let me be very explicit. Lots of industrial policy is about not giving out money for the sake of simply subsidizing the private sector. It's about shaping markets, industry, introducing conditions for public, so creating, if you want, a social contract that makes companies responsible for job creation, investment, innovation. It's interesting how in the US at the moment, this aspect has been sort of forgotten. And lots of highly financialized companies are receiving huge amount of resources that are supposed to finance the investment that we're supposed to make themselves. If you think about the CHIPS Act or some of the elements in the IRA. So this link between financialization and industrial policy is very relevant in South Africa, but I think it's relevant in all those countries which have experienced high level of financialization over the last years. Now, the paper is structured in a relatively long paper. We have actually more extended work, also some econometric work that Sophie is leading in also capturing different dimensions of financialization, and we'll come back to that later. But fundamentally starts from really positioning or reviewing, doing a sort of meta research on where the financialization debate has got to, and how these different streams of work have or not managed to different perspective and evidence to understand, to provide a sufficient holistic picture of dynamic of financialization. This is why I will spend the first part of my presentation in very briefly, we can come back in the discussion if you want later, to review some of the, if you want, micro, meso, macro level ways, literature that have addressed financialization. And I'll move towards the literature which has more than others tried to start looking at financialization in middle-income countries with a focus on specific institutional players, for example, pension funds, but also some, to a certain extent, some of the corporation operating in the manufacturing, ICT service, the more industrial sectors. I will then try to unpack what we call the sources, processes, and outcomes of corporate financialization, and I will try to, in a schematic way, to introduce our analytical framework, and then I will try to convince you that this analytical framework is actually potentially revealing aspects that other type of research have not put together in the same way. And of course, as I said, this is work in progress, and we are very keen to have comments and critiques and suggestions on how to improve and clarify the work. Now, let me just start with this brief review of the literature. So as I stressed, we want to understand how financialization has figured in the literature on productive development, structural transformation, and of course, organization of global value chains. The literature on global value chains, as we know, has exploded over the last years, 20, 30 years, and has become a main framework to understand dependency issues, issues around differential type of industrialization across countries, corporate governance issues, and so on. And within this literature, there are three main streams that we have sort of identified as relevant for the work that we are doing here. Well, there is a first literature which has been linking the shareholder value doctrine to the formation of global value chains. Here in particular, the work of people like William Milberg at the New School of Social Research, who is always trying to identify how the formation of value chain, it's not simply a organizational and trade-related process, but actually is part of a political economy, global political economy transition, where fundamentally the multinational, transnational corporation become extremely powerful and start organizing the supply chain in the broader economy and trade patterns in a very pervasive way. And financialization is both an outcome of that process and a facilitator, something that makes possible that way of organizing global production. In a sense, all this literature continues to the seminal work that Stefan Heimer introduced in the 70s, when fundamentally we were questioning the extent to which transnational corporations were not simply affecting, if you want, production technologies, but the broader development of countries in which they were operating, and affecting, of course, competition, industrial dynamics. There is a second stream of literature where also my co-author Sophie has been contributing to, which is related to understanding actually financialization in specific value chain. And the work on the food system and commodity chains here has been particularly relevant. Of course, commodity chains will come back in the discussion of South Africa, and are very relevant because this is a sectoral value chain where you have, as a result of cyclical processes, moments of extremely high profits. And since the beginning, the spoiler here would be that all those sectors where there are significant profits or significant rents tend to become a main target of financialization dynamics. And there is a third one, which is more related to global wealth chain, which has been basically focusing on the way in which financial transaction and operation of lead firms shape basically value chains in a broader. Now, lots of these are more theoretical, high level, and in many cases focus predominantly on the studies of multinationals with headquarters in the global financial centers, and they try to unpack the link between these financial centers and these multinational, transnational corporations operating across the global south. It's another stream of literature, which is in fact started from a very different analytical angle, which has been basically the one, and here we have colleagues also who have been from SOAS, who started seminal work here with their PhDs over the last decade, people like Bruno Bonizzi, for example, who were fundamentally interested in understanding financialization from the point of view of the subordinate position in financial systems of many developing economies. And South Africa in this research has featured quite significantly. Now, the main analytical lens in this kind of literature has been unpacking macro dynamics of subordination, which means that big emphasis has been given to the role of global finance and the way in which global finance linking global production cause and reproduce vulnerabilities in macroeconomic conditions as well as volatilities in this country's environment. Many of these literature have also expanded towards looking at broader institutional setting, and so the idea of a variegated financialization form, which materialize in different contexts, time, and space, and affect not just the productive sector, not just the financial sector, but also consumption, patterns of social reproduction, and so on. And finally, there is a third block, which goes back to the work also of Hag Victaker and others, who have more closely to what we've been doing, try to link financialization and premature forms of financialization to the so-called literature on premature deindustrialization. As you might be familiar, the literature on premature deindustrialization, which has been, again, very South Africa case and many other cases across the global south, has always sort of pointed out how countries enter into patterns of decline in terms of share of contribution of value addition in manufacturing or employment in a sort of inverted U shape over time, but that is happening in a very, in some countries happening at the earlier stages of their GDP, so they are in stages of premature deindustrialization. And we know also that this premature deindustrialization in many cases is associated with lack of productive investment. So the tendency towards a more rentieristic, financialized kind of economy. So this literature points in the same direction we're looking at, but tend to be more predominantly macro-focused. And when we look at the way in which corporations are looked at, very often the starting point and sometimes the ending point is to look at their financial processes. What we would like to do in our work is actually to make the farther bridge. And the farther bridge can be understood from the literature which has been actually looking at the tier of the firm and the tier of the growth of the firm. And this is a literature which, in a sense, it's very much, although not very well known, but is very much born and developed in SOAS, starting with the work of Edith Penrose, who introduced, of course, the research capability tier of the firm, and later sketched out how firms are fundamentally there are internal compulsion and mechanisms that push firms towards a continuous pattern of growth. And this expansion of the growth of the firm is very much driven by a pattern of retain and reinvest, which means companies are internally financing the expansion of their and the diversification of their activities. And this is very much the work that in a Penrosian fashion and Chandlerian fashion, William Lazonik and others have picked up over the last 3 decades. Now, within this literature, there are, the focus of this literature is very much at the micro level, at the corporation level, start from an understanding of processes of innovation and the tensions between innovation and organization, look at accumulation process organizational dynamics, and links that to the institutional setting. So it's very close to, and I myself work in this area, very close to, if you want, that micro understanding of financialization. However, so far has always been mainly focused on advanced industrialized economies, and in particular, the extent to which the forms of financialization in these economies were resulting from specific regulatory, institutional, corporate governance regimes. Now, in the context of the US, we know that over the last 3 decades, there is dramatic financialization, mainly driven by stock buybacks operation, companies like Cisco, companies in the ICT sector, in the pharma industry, and so on. So those which have exploded in terms of their returns have experienced dramatic financialization. In the context of Europe and UK, well, in the case of Europe, we have a lower level of financialization, mainly driven by dividends. In the case of the UK, we have a mix of both syndrome, less than the US, more than the EU, but at the same time, a mix of stock buybacks and dividends distribution. So we had lots of evidence of how financialization works in the interface of corporate governance, productive organization, and the financial markets, and how financial markets become the institutional vehicles through which resources are extracted, not allocated to productive organization. But we know much less about how this works from this specific analytical point of view in emerging economies. Let me just emphasize this point. We have just published, as Victor kindly referred to, this book in December 2022, which came out from a project here at SOAS, funded by the Gatsby Foundation, which basically was looking at pharma industry. We had our work completed before the pandemic, but we had to, of course, restart working on our company cases, in this case, AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, to understand how they were navigating their pandemic type of recovery or opportunities for expansion. And lots of the work we were doing there was trying to figure out what was the dynamics globally on the financial, in terms of the pharma industry, in terms of financialization in the pharma industry. And, when you start looking at typical parameters of financialization, for example, the extent to which the payout in the form of stock buybacks or dividends is overtaking the net profits or the turnover of these companies. So these companies are basically selling out assets in order to distribute their dividends. And you compare that against the extent to which these companies are remaining innovative, then you start seeing a number of puzzles. So some companies clearly were in a specific, quite dramatic financialization. That financialization was not so evident because these companies were having in their pipeline very successful drugs and blockbuster drugs. So they were fundamentally lost, extracted in this period. But when these companies faced patent cliff or situation of collapsing profits, then suddenly these companies became vulnerable. And if you remember, AstraZeneca was for a takeover from Pfizer in 2014, and there were other similar cases. So in this book, we analyze a typical dynamic of companies which were going through a process of retain reinvest. Then they were becoming more financialized, and they were downsizing, and they were distributing lots of payout, and then a process where potentially we're losing their competitiveness. In the book, we show that actually these companies have sort of stopped on the verge of collapsing, and they sort of tried in the last few years actually to shift back to from financialization to innovation. Now, the problem is that all these companies, even if they're highly financialized, they were for a certain period of time extremely highly productive and extremely innovative. Now, when we think about many middle-income countries, some of the large corporations of this scale not always had the same pattern of if you want, capitalist accumulation. Some of them actually became extremely large, extremely big, not because they were innovative, but because they were state monopolies, because there was not sufficient competition in that context, because they were leveraging their political influence. There were lots of reasons why, alongside traditional Schumpeterian innovative rents, they were making significant profits, and they were expanding their footprint. Now, the question is, then potentially in these kind of countries, we need to understand better how these corporations are formed, and how, as a result of the specific structural condition in these countries of formation and capitalist accumulation, how basically they are financializing. What are the specific forms that this financialization take? And this is exactly where our work starts. It's a sort of, if you want, intuition that we need to potentially re-question how financialization work in context where not simply the institutional context is different, but the processes of capitalist accumulation are fundamentally different. And here we, as I mentioned from the beginning, we try to look at different forms, and with forms we mean different sources of finance, which is then captured and financialized, and different processes. Finance that has been captured from this corporation is distributed to different type of shareholders, both domestically or internationally. And finally, what is the outcome? What is the kind of developmental impact of these sources and processes at place? Now, in many of these countries, here I'll skip a few points because I want to be able to spend enough time in the discussion later on. But many of us who are working in middle-income countries, we know that the condition of capitalist accumulation are very different for very different reasons. Companies who are trying to, who are becoming listed companies, who have reached a certain level of expansion, they are operating within more than one market, of course. So they are integrated in regional value chain, sometimes in global value chain. They are both linking backward towards the domestic economies, often in the research sectors, and they're trying to penetrate other markets. And they struggle with both linking up into the value chains and linking back into their domestic context. And they're also, of course, they're also struggling in terms of keeping pace with the level of technological change that we are seeing emerging in many of these. Now, the issue is that these companies not only have a structural condition in terms of production, which is unfavorable, and that's why in many cases they try to find alternative ways to position themselves and anchor themselves to different forms of rents, but also are, from a financial point of view, in a quite precarious situation because they are fundamentally embedded into a hierarchical global finance systems, which make, in many cases, them more vulnerable to a number of macro currency and other type of shocks and issues. Now, this makes us thinking that effectively we need to identify different type of sources, a different type of processes of financialization, and in a sense, we start from looking at the potential sources because to a certain extent, processes of financialization will result from the kind of specific types of sources that emerge in this corporation. Here we distinguish 5 types of potential type of rents. Here we use a concept of rents in a classical political economy sense, if you want, and we are thinking about, of course, the traditional idea that some companies can be innovative and they can benefit from some Schumpeterian rents. We know increasingly that companies along value chain, they can leverage their position in the value chain to extract rents either in the downstream market or upstream, and so extract rents chains. We know that they, especially in countries, middle-income countries, where level of competitions are not particularly, the markets is not providing that competitive pressure. We have many companies who are benefiting from market rents. There are, if you go back to South Africa, as I will show later, across all upstream industries, from cement to steel to many chemicals and so on, you have significant amount of competition problems, which of course give market rents to the players, both, as I said, from the point of view of extracting rents along the value chain, so vertically, but also horizontally in the market. And of course, many of these companies are too big to be indifferent to political dynamics. So there are lots of policy rents in terms of possibility of public assets capture of land rights, influence of corporate governance, regulatory regime, and reforms. Many of them, for example, are, and this is a quite general pattern, used to be state-owned enterprises which were later privatized and which retained lots of the rents that a state-owned enterprise has, but were then becoming, in private hands. And finally, there are lots of financial rents that these companies are potentially leveraging their balance sheets, leveraging their position of power, doing financial engineering, in many cases, transforming the boundaries between the core business activity, let's say, value chain or ICT value chain, and becoming much more focused towards financial transaction. And we see this across, of course, not just South Africa, but the broader continent. If we think about, for example, what is happening in money transfers and in the telecommunication sector. Now, the way in which we summarize all this is to basically say, well, we have a country which is setting and operating in a regional context. Of course, that regional context matters from the point of view of markets and value chain, but fundamentally the big rules are set at the global level in the macro financial markets. These different type of rents, those in red are those that are resulting from non-productive investment, non-innovative activities, are actually entering into these different value chains. Depending on where the firms is at the level of the value chain, can have more of one type of rents than the other. And within these value chains, these resources are concentrated in this key corporation. Part of this finance is retained and reinvested, small amount, but more of that is actually siphoned out through different processes, which are in some cases similar to the one we see in advanced economies, so stock buybacks, dividends, debt interest rates issues, and so on, increasing financial operation and so on, but also siphoned out from the country in the more subordinate financialization kind of processes. These processes are very often related to the fact that this corporation operates at the interface between global markets and domestic markets. In cases they need to leverage their balance sheet. The leveraging of their balance sheet is constrained, and they have and they have to retain excessive cash holdings for precautionary kind of reasons. They also need to protect themselves against currency issues, and so they tend to hold US dollars yielding financial assets to generate foreign exchange and to balance out their books in many respects. So there is lots of these companies, lots of dynamics that are specific to their subordinate position, which make the normal process of financialization I described here even more acute and can in some cases accelerate them. That's why we talk about financialization on steroids. Now, I already made the case, South Africa is a perfect case for looking at these issues. South Africa has the highest stock market capitalization as percentage of GDP, second only to Hong Kong in the global South, is an economy which has been, of course, studied from the point of view of financialization in or rents extraction in the energy mineral complex. And again, SOAS has been doing lots of work in this space over the years. Where we had less knowledge was in sectors which were not the traditional energy mineral sector, but more industrial, ICT, food, and so on value chains, where actually lots of dynamism is emerging in the last years. Again, when we compare South Africa against other middle-income countries, the typical syndrome of a prematurely deindustrialized country can become evident. A country where there is a growing financial sector, which is not translating into investment. Level of unemployment are extremely high. Average gross fixed capital formation is actually far below, both in terms of trend and in terms of volume, the other comparable upper middle income countries. And the GDP is extremely volatile and extremely vulnerable. It's also a country where the trade position of the country depends dramatically on export of commodities, which means that it's very vulnerable to commodity price shocks, and that has a knock-down effect on other sectors of the economy, which are in moment of expansion, of course, badly affected in terms of over appreciation of the currency, and in other phases are, in fact, not. And of course, this is also a sector where the link between royalties, rents coming from minerals are not actually translating naturally into investment in a closely related sector. Having said that, as the cover of the book suggests, South Africa is still a country where the manufacturing industry vis-a-vis other countries in the continent is relatively well developed, where there is a significant, for example, mining equipment industry, which has a leading position around the world in a number of segments, not just processing, underground, yellow goods. But it's a country where all this potential has been remained locked as a result of fundamentally a very modest pattern of investment. Now, to understand who is driving investment in a country like South Africa, we cannot, and large investment, we cannot just look at the large micro SME type of setting. We need to really focus on the major players who are fundamentally linking South Africa to the regional markets and in some cases even globally. Now, these are the three companies that we use for our study. Sasol is, for those who are in African working industry, know who exactly well who Sasol is. This is a company coming, of course, from the pre-apartheid period, major chemical industry with a footprint, a global footprint, with operation in the US, in Europe, and in the Far East. A company which, by the way, is central at the moment in the green transition, even more than Eskom. Sasol has proprietary technologies in a number of areas. So it's a company which for many years had some form of Schumpeterian rents and development, but that over the last 30 years, especially after the large privatization, the state still controls some shares there, has become, we argue, and I'll show you later, very financialized. The other two, Shoprite and MTN, again, those working in Africa might have had an MTN SIM. This is, of course, a telecommunication companies, but also a company which has diversified and become extremely centered around transaction. They have now a bank facility. They have spin out in money transfer and several other activities related to that. And Shoprite is another key player. Now, MTN, if you want, is more downstream along the chain, right? It's very close to the market. Shoprite is actually a more traditional company in the sense that they are in the retailing of food products and supermarkets, and they control a very critical value chain across Africa. As we know, given the characteristics of the economies, the dimensions of the kind of portfolio that people spend, food and food items are extremely important in understanding also the rise of the middle class. So places like companies like Shoprite really at the center core of linking lots of the traditional food industries to the final markets. And of course, being at the middle of that value chain, they can actually control significant rents chain, which means they can have significant markups, and they can also build up financial operation back in that industry. Now, I just started mentioning a few things. Now we'll take the rest of the seminar just to go through the essays, just to say that each of these companies, when you look at their different position, they all have engaged in different way to issues around subordination in finance in terms of market rents. I mentioned, for example, how a company like Sasol, of course, have a monopolistic position as a single supplier of multiple downstream value chain, or issues around Shoprite and their capacity to extract rents chain. So this is just a summary table where we started from, which was trying to map out what characteristics against the framework we developed these companies feature, and what we would expect to find and how we would explain their financialization internally. Those slides before I close. And here, let me try to spend a bit of time in showing you how we gathered this evidence. So we spent quite a lot of time, and here Nishal is the person who spent more than hours time in looking at each individual statement to actually capture both the way in which firms were sourcing finance, the way in which they were, what were the source of profits, and how they were fundamentally redistributing that. We also look at the ownership structure, and we looked at how the ownership structure may also affect decisions in terms of distribution. These kind of metrics were also combined with an understanding of capital investment, so the capex I mentioned, and an understanding, if you want, of the nature of the type of distribution. So if we are talking about payouts in the form of dividends or in the forms of stock buybacks. Now, there are a number of things that emerge here. First of all, that the distribution to financial markets relative to net profits across all of them has increased substantially over the last decade. It's roughly has doubled for all three companies. In the paper, you have much more detail. I don't have time now to go into the details, but it's all there, and we're happy to provide more detailed information. Now, interestingly enough, the distribution of financial markets is happening via dividends. Buybacks have become relatively less important, and interest more important. So these are companies, I'm now trying to just stylize the picture, who are fundamentally stop retaining and reinvesting, are when they are investing, they tend to expose themselves with significant debt. The debt that they have to serve will enter into their books, and they will create a problem in terms of future investment and future space and cash to expand. And there are companies which, for the corporate regulation in the country, are allowed to do a number of operations which are actually completely counterproductive. So similar to the US, differently from the UK, especially in the context of large conglomerate with holding structures, the mother company can actually do stock buybacks operation within the conglomerates itself, right? So you can see immediately how the corporate governance regulation here can be vulnerable to a number of very rentieristic type of processes that undermine fundamentally the productive base of these companies. And of course, there's also companies that are operating in a context where even when you have state-owned, partially state-owned companies, in Sasol, I think there is still a 25-26% coming from the pension fund. Well, the institutional funders and the strategic funders are more operating as value extractor. They're not particularly interested on the long-term expansion of these companies. They are fundamentally satisfied with a relatively high and constant dividend. And this is a problem that we highlight also in the context of the UK, where companies have managed to stop using stock buybacks. Companies like AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline have fundamentally gave out a stock buybacks program after 2015, but they had to find an agreement with their board in terms of keeping very high level of dividends. So dividends have become a sort of entitlement, given the kind of ownership structure and corporate governance used there. When we look at the, and this is the last slide, when we look at the macroeconomic aspect of that, meaning how the subordinate financialization affect these, as a more macro financial person is more capable than me to articulate this, but fundamentally, many of these firms have increasingly access foreign denominated debt to access low interest rates in international financial markets. As you know, South Africa has a very, talking about concentration, very difficult banking sector. There are problems in terms of channeling resources towards productive investment. Even the IDC, which is the Industrial Development Corporation, has over the years had moments in which actually was not able to provide that kind of developmental finance and credit that was required. So it's a country where we are not surprised firms who have the capacity to do so try to leverage international financial markets for some of their investment. And these kind of foreign denominated debt also is reflected in an increasing share of US denominated debt in overall debt, and a reduction in the average interest paid on outstanding debt. And this is done again to counterbalance part of the exposure that otherwise this company will have. And in a sense, what we are seeing here is not necessarily a story that goes in one direction. So firms are trying in some cases to react to this kind of financialization dynamics, but the pressure comes from different directions, comes from macro systemic issues as much as from the corporate side, from within the corporation in terms of the ownership structure and what the ownership structure demands. Now, we could spend more time to go through all of them, but fundamentally, this is the gist of all the story here, which is basically trying to start building up evidence at the firm level, which allows us to understand how strategic players in the country are potentially not delivering the kind of investment-led development that is badly required. It's badly required in order to drive the structural transformation that I started from. And becomes even more important because, as I mentioned in the very beginning, we can only have successful industrial policy if successful industrial policy are able to channel to replace investment that is not happening in the private sector, but actually to complement. So there is a problem of crowding investment in the same direction. And so we want to avoid the situations where actually states are indirectly subsidizing companies, which are actually losing money or extracting money in various forms, the processes we described, We didn't go into the discussion of fiscal issues, illicit financial flows, or semi-illicit financial flows, but there are lots of mechanisms that are draining out resources from the continent, and these firms are at the center of the problem and the solution to the problem. So finding ways to understand industrial policy also from a corporate governance point of view and shaping the industry and institutional setting in such a way that is conducive to investment, employment generation, innovation. It's the bottom line of all this exercise. Thanks for being patient. I think I used my 40 minutes, if even more, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Very, very interesting, clearly presented. I did learn quite a lot, actually, from this presentation, which presents, offers a very important aspect. It lends into the role of international financial markets with these 3 case studies of Sasol, Shoprite, and MTN, which are big companies on the African continent. And I guess, given the current developments in Africa with the African Continental Free Trade Area, they possibly going to expand their reach across the many dimensions of the continent. With Sasol, it's kind of a global aspect. And I suppose this is timely. It's timely because of the implications already it has, especially for Africa, for Shoprite and MTN, and also looking into the future of these operations and the importance of financial markets. What happens in terms of dividends, interest on payments, and maybe it's think also, of course, of other forms of financing that possibly would have averted this type of problem of financialization. Absolutely spot on, and I guess this forms a very important aspect. I could see a way in which this research could be completely continued into many other dimensions, interrogating the role of dividend policy in financialization. That comes out very, very, very much. Because you see, for the last 50 years, since the birth of finance in 1958, the question of dividends has not been resolved. 2 questions: to pay or not to pay the dividend, the decision to opt or not to pay the dividend. And then the second one is how much to pay in dividend. There is no standard model that can predict the amount you pay in dividends. And if you can have people have, we are all working on this. We're working on it. And in a way, Andreoni puts an important lens to it. You see, dividends play an important role here. And maybe it's because we don't have a formal model that can capture the decision of how much should you pay in dividends. They are an optimum level. Okay. So CEOs are likely to get away with it. Investors are likely to get away with it. They can push. And on the first question of to pay or not to pay the dividend, it's possible that CEOs have an option of opting out, say, we can't pay dividend. We can't say money generated in profits is going to be plowed into future investment. Shareholders, please hold your fire. We need to hold on for another 2 years before we pay dividend. No, they pay the dividend. In this case, it's extortion. It's extortion. Okay. There are so many important questions that came up in my formed themselves in my mind, provoked by what Antonio has been able to share with us. So at this juncture, I would like to invite participants for comments, views, and if possible, please turn on your camera and unless you are worried about the bandwidth of your where you are talking from. So I can see already 2 hands up. I'm going to okay. So there is a hand of Hong. Hong Boy is our professor of financial economics at SOAS, and then Dak, who is the professor of practice also on Center for Global Finance. So Hong first, and then after that, Dak.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks, Antonia, for the very detailed explanation about the paper I think this is something that is very close to my own research, and that's exciting. So it's good that you actually focused on the firm level, the financialization of non-financial firms. As far as I know, there are so many non-financial firms. They are actually investing in the financial products. So, for example, I saw a news, maybe 2 years ago. Google has its own. Google is a tech, but just use Google as an example. Has its own hedge fund. Yeah. So this is a very, very popular. So my first question is how to define financialization on the firm level for a firm. For example, as a firm, I prefer to be financialized if I'm already good enough. Yeah, so I do my investment. I have no problem in demand, sales, etc. I prefer to make more money by using my money so that I can do more. Yeah. So how to define this? And that's the first issue. Once we define this, there is a trade-off. In terms, there is a trade-off. There is a threshold. How much is good, or how much do we mean it is already negative something? So there is a threshold something I think that we need to think about. And the reason why I asked the first question is linked to the second one, because if you think about the capital gains of firms, they actually can do good things rather than do bad things. For example, all the firms in general, in my literature, they are facing financial constraints. So if I have some additional capital gains, then I can invest, I can relax my financial constraints. I can probably invest in innovation projects that I would have not able to do. So so they can do good things actually. So because there is a literature so they talk about capital gains and the impact of non-financial firms' capital gains on their performance or productivity. So that's the second issue. And the third issue that I want to point out, I was thinking about the financialization problem on the country level. So there is a financialization in terms of a country's financial system. Yeah. And that probably we can see some other examples. For example, China, they are talking about there are too much things that they invested in the real estate sector, financial sector, and they do not really invest in the real sector. So that hurts the real economy. However, this case probably does not apply to all the countries. For example, African countries. At the first, they probably do not have a developed financial system anyway. So those good firms, by financializing themselves, they probably can promote a little bit in terms of the whole financial system. So we need to, when we talk about the firm level financialization, whether or not we need to put this thing into the context of the financialization of the whole financial system. So that's the third comments. Very interesting. I'm very excited to see, Andreoni, that you have done so much work in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hong. And let me see whether Antonio or indeed Sophie, who is in the audience, I would like to engage with this question.
Sure. Let me do. Sophie, are you in? I was checking on the phone. If Sophie is in, I will leave her to address potentially the macro financial aspect of that, so she can also bring her perspective into it. But let me, if she's in, I'm not sure 100%. But let me try to start with your questions around, how do we define financialization, and how much is good, and how much is good dividend distribution, how much is too, right? That problem. So in a sense, the issue here, it's very, and this is why we do this kind of detailed company work, it's very much related to the specific trajectory of that kind of corporation in the specific context in which they operate, right? So there are situations where the companies we look at are launching stock buybacks programs, or they are putting out a dividend policy, and at the same time they are stretching their position, the debitory position, international finance or other financial sources to actually finance the investment. That, of course, use debt to finance stock buybacks or dividends, but indirectly there is a nexus there. So when you have a company which is basically, let's say, facing a patent cliff, let me go to the AstraZeneca case, which we have studied in great detail in the book. This is a company where the same CEO, when got into 2013, October, Pascal Soriot, actually notoriously said this company stopped being able to do drugs. We don't have a pipeline of drugs, but we have actually completely financialized processes internally. So it's a matter of understanding not so much, I think, the threshold when things become financialized. It's more about understanding the tensions between innovation dynamics, investment dynamics within the companies, and what is happening on the financial side and the financialization side. When these two relationships become clearly unbalanced and skewed, then the problem of financialization take over, and you can have that a number of these companies compromise their position, the long-term position. There are lots of reasons why companies might decide to do some of these operations, and all the time we present this kind of work. The typical example even I gave before, sometimes stock buybacks operations are put in place in order to avoid potential takeovers, or companies claim that there are not sufficient investment opportunities. The so-called literature on the secular stagnation and all the Larry Summers type of stuff there seem to be a justification for that. I think it's absolutely ungrounded. I think the main problem is that many corporations are fundamentally within their boards and within their CEOs, they have lost the capacity to size investment, to reinvest, and in many cases, that tensions has arisen has become so unbalanced. So suddenly, what was a normal dynamics, as you were explaining, of leveraging certain capital gains to be able to expand certain type of branch of activities and so on, is no more finance, is no more strategic to the core business of these manufacturing or non-financial companies, but becomes the core business itself. And I think the third element related to what you were saying, and if Sophie is here, I'll then shut up. It's actually, I always found extremely helpful and to read, financial history. And I saw Sharon Driver is also here, so there are people who have been spending many more years than me working on this. But when I read the work of, Lazonic, Mary O'Sullivan, who came together actually at SOAS, a book on dividends of development and other contribution on the role of financial market in the expansion of the US in the 19th century or in other parts of the world, what you see is that, the financial sector was important in a number of specific areas of investment, but effectively corporate governance and the corporations were expanding in a process of capitalist accumulation, which was very different from what we suggest today developing countries to follow, right? There has been a big debate between how financial system vis-a-vis stock markets, vis-a-vis banking system would be the most adequate to develop. I think there has not been enough discussion around actually how financialization of the type I described is actually undermining that fundamental process of retain and reinvest, which is required not just to increase the footprint of the company, but basically to reinvest in the domestic economy, and in doing that, pulling up local supply chains, pulling up employment, and so on and so forth. So my answer to your questions is, I agree completely with you. There are no definitions of, in my opinion, of what is 100% financialization. There are specific cases where we can see how the tension, it's clearly going in one direction instead of the other. And I think there is to be more work to be done in understanding in these specific countries, at this specific stage of structural transformation they are in, what kind of finance is actually needed for the goal of transforming their productive base. And that is something that will not be just about developing finance, but is also have to be about what corporate governance rules are in place that discourage the kind of downsize, distribute activities that we have here. I haven't even entered into, I mentioned before, issues around, for example, competition policy, right? You could address some of these issues entering from very different angles, right? You can enter from the corporate governance angle, from the competition policy angle, for the industrial policy angle, and potentially all these should go in the same direction. Sophie, are you around?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm not sure you can hear me.
We can hear you.
I'm in a very crowded train, and Hong, I'm sorry, I haven't heard the your question very well because the internet was disrupted a couple of times. But was it about what financialization at the macro level does?
Yeah.
Basically, okay. I think so. There are two aspects of our argument. The one is, so it's basically the too much finance argument. Finance can be extractive, but it can also be productive, right? So you were talking about how finance can be used in a productive way, but it can also turn into something very extractive, which then hinders production because firms go from productive activities to all of the profits being channeled towards finance and being extracted. So that's the argument that we're making. If financialization takes place, that's basically what happens. The subordinate financialization argument is the story about firms being in a different position in lower middle income countries where they have less access to low interest rate loans. So often they're then being forced to borrow in the international market in US dollars, which means you have a currency mismatch on your balance sheet and you need to compensate for this. And often they compensate for this, which is the Shoprite case, by then investing in US dollar assets. Now, the US dollar asset investment then is surely just because they need to service that US denominated debt. So there's an imbalance between the access to finance or cheap finance, which is determined by the currency hierarchies. And so these firms then have a disadvantage in that respect. The other story is that these firms, and this is not in this paper, but in the project that Antonio was talking about when we were doing a larger sample regression analysis, that these firms are often not able to leverage as much as firms in, let's say, financial centers. So they can't take on as much debt because they are perceived as being more risky. So you have a situation where these firms have to provide higher dividends in order to pull investors, right, create pull factors, and at the same time they can't leverage their balance sheet as much because they're perceived as being more risky. They're also situated in a more macroeconomic volatile environment, and therefore they systematically disadvantaged then with respect to, let's say, firms in the financial centers. I'm not sure this answers your question, but I really hope you could even hear me because it's quite noisy. I'm really sorry.
We can hear you, don't worry.
Thank you so much, Sophie. I think that was absolutely helpful. Thank you, Antonio, for the discussion. Thank you, Hong, for those points. Maybe I should move next to Dak. Dak is at ODI. He's also our professor of practice here at Center for Global Finance at SOAS.
Hi, good afternoon. I think thanks, Victor, and hello, Antonio, and thanks, and Sophie. Actually, my questions were pretty similar, and I think and your answers actually help already, but it may also be reflected in the paper if you're still writing it. And so, and the first one is, what is financialization, and is it different compared to sort of more finance, right? So what's the difference between financialization and just more finance? And I always thought that it was something special about financialization. It always had a sort of a negative connotation, but I don't know whether that is the case. But you have three levels. So you've got micro, meso, stroke value chain, and macro. So you could potentially then sort of have at least a table of how you measure it, right? How do you measure these financialization at the different dimensions? And I think that in itself will be very interesting. So because you said micro level, you have firms, and there's particularly the lead firms, but actually what is the current assessment of financialization or availability of finance at a value in the value chain is going to be quite interesting, and how is it going to be distributed across the different firms. And then the second point, exactly what Hong Bo's asked, is basically, if you think about a framework for financialization, you want to know when is it good, when is it bad, and and you talked a bit about usage, and I think that's exactly the right thing. So you have sources of financialization, and you have and finance, and then you have uses of them, and I suppose you have a categorization of the sources, you have rents and so on, but you can also have just have a categorization of the uses, and then the thing that we learned from the financial crisis at a macro level was that the two can't be seen as separate anymore, because the way the finance is generated, whether it's short-term versus long-term, for example, matters, because if it's only short-term, then you've got a crisis, right? And I think that may be also then relevant for your framework, is that actually you could still say, well, as long as it's being used well, it doesn't matter. But actually, that's not the case anymore, because it also depends on how it's being raised, and so those sort of questions become important. So I think that should be part of your framework, and your answers already helped there. I suppose on the macro level, I don't know whether you want to too much on that, but I think there you could just link into the debate on, so have some paper by Thorsten Beck, for example, who would say more finance is better, particularly at lower income levels. But then you have the Adair Turners, the Avinash Barsots, who basically say too much finance isn't good. There can also be socially useless finance, and you can have herding behavior. Maybe that's a micro level there as well, is that too many finance is plowing into some particular firms, and you get too much finance, and there's pressure to spend too much. And I think that's also, and it's not just a threshold thing, and those thresholds change over time, and there are measurement errors and so on, but it's also a speed. And I think that's the work that we did with Stephanie Griffith-Jones and also Victor Murinde. I think you were involved in it as well, like a decade ago or so. It's also, so if there can be too much finance, but it can also be too much finance in a short period of time, even at low income levels, and then you have too much pressure to spend. And I suppose that may also something that you can think about is the speed by which it needs to be spent, and that you then go into the wrong uses, a bit too much pressure there. But I mean, overall, I find it very interesting, and I think it's really interesting to know more about sort of the link between finance and development. And these are live discussions, of course, as you well know, but it's also like a discussion. That's my final point about BAI just recently. Should I be spending more money on the financial sector? So developing the financial sector to be more efficient or whatever it is, and that can then benefit lots of firms. Or should they invest more in the real sector? And they then basically often say, well, they think there's not enough financialization in the economy, so therefore there needs to be more, at least not finance, needs more finance. But yeah, it all depends on how the financial sector is actually using it. And I think in this case, it's also how are the non-financial sector firms actually using the finance is the key thing, right? That's and some categorization of that, and I think you have that, but that will be very neat. Let me stop there. So congratulations on the fantastic research, and very interesting. Thanks.
Thanks, Dirk. I'll reply quickly. So in terms of the measurement aspects, there are lots of studies in the literature review that you see. We mentioned quite a few studies from the classical ones on financialization. That again, SOAS has been very prominent in this debate for many years. And on the macro side, we have a number of different parameters. And of course, the parameters are always related to the specific theoretical framing of capitalism and different type of emphasis on different dimensions. So that's, I think, what we are trying to do at the micro level. It's something that, as I said, brings the kind of empirical approach that has been used by people like Lazonic and others. By the way, there are other parameters I didn't show here, but there are things like in the books like capital goods, goodwill accounts, and other type of elements that could be understood, especially in sectors where potentially companies are able to create artificial value by putting in the book significant type of value related to brands, related to future returns from activities, And by doing that, they actually create space in the budget, which allows them to actually take lots of money out from the company. There are people who have done also work in this space. So what I'm saying is there is quite a lot of metrics, and we're using some of them, as Sophie was saying, to try to come out with some of more stylized econometric evidence on some of these issues. On the other hand, I would say, I think what we really need to probably shift is towards understanding financial markets and understanding these companies really for what they are in the context, building from an historical understanding of in what stage of capitalism and structural transformation are, and how fundamentally processes within these corporations operate. Because lots of the kind of studies of more or less of finance and so on, these always come from a fundamental neoclassical type of approach, which is making a number of assumptions around what the financial market is supposed to do, allocative efficiency, and all the type of things that, from my point of view, don't make sense. We should have realized after all these crises that don't make sense in an advanced financial, highly developed, in-depth and kind of products, financial market, and advanced economy. In these countries, they are the last of the functioning bit. They are fundamentally the gambling casino a la Keynes, and they are very much dangerous for development. So from that point of view, someone claiming we just need to have a more efficient financial market, I think is completely missing the point of what these countries are and in what stage of capitalist transformation they are. So that would be my harsh response to that kind of more neoclassical type of approach to the problem. But I completely agree with you. It would be very good to try to do more of the kind of work that Sophie was mentioning. So try to find some econometric evidence around the more general trends so that we can have a better sense of the good, bad part. But I would say regulation really needs to start from an understanding of these micro corporation level processes. Otherwise, we are never going to be able to actually affect them, right? Because more finance, less finance, more regulation one way or the other. These are not macro variables that change the setting, are institutional regulations that make the setting more, they shape that industry in a way that is more pro-developmental. But I think we are on the same page, so I'm
Thank you very much, Antonio, and thanks, Doug, for those great ideas, comments, and questions. Let me call upon Kieran. Kieran is a professor of economics in the School of Finance and Management. Kieran, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Antonio and Sophie. It's great to see so much work being done just recently on the South African economy, not just with your own Oxford volume, from which I think an earlier version of this paper was taken, but also the Oxford Handbook of the South African Economy, also in which you have some work, I think. And there's a vast number of interesting questions being pursued, some of which we've heard today. I just want to focus on a very small corner of the discussion by going back to your reference to deindustrialization and financialization, because I think the two are linked, and it's interesting, I think, to discuss the ways in which they're linked. Probably there is some kind of bicausality between these two concepts. But in the case of South Africa, I sometimes think that originally the deindustrialization, premature deindustrialization, came first with the failure of the attempt to liberalize trade just after the transition, and the failure of the manufacturing sector to, well, some of it's the demise of some of it, in fact, but the real difficulties that others had in entering supply chains and so on, maybe apart from the automotive sector, which did quite well. But one of the questions then is, why was there not foreign direct investment into the South African manufacturing sector? So it actually is astonishingly small. If you look at it, some people tried to put things in terms of the number of aircraft carriers equivalent or whatever, but I prefer to look at it in terms of the number of medium-term power stations. You could, in 1 year, you would have approximately the same FDI into the entire manufacturing sector in South Africa, 2 medium power stations worth. that is how bad the situation is. And of course, foreign direct investment is much less given to financialization than short-term portfolio movements. So in a way, I sometimes think that it can be looked upon as financialization being the result of a failed industrialization, premature deindustrialization, and financialization took up the slack in some senses. And of course, primarily because of that, it has been the bad aspects of financialization that we have experienced as resources continue to be siphoned off from the manufacturing sector. The manufacturing sector, you said manufacturing profitability was high in South Africa, and it is to some extent perhaps comparable, I would say more than comparable to other countries, but in manufacturing, it is much lower than in other sectors. So we do have that difficulty. I don't want to go on too much longer. Could I just have a plug for, in terms of the dividend discussion, for with Anna Grossman, Pasquale Scaramuzzino, and Kigli Lusame from the South African Treasury. We've published a paper on dividends in South Africa for the South African Reserve Bank, which is a working paper, and we'd very much like to get some feedback on that if any of you managed to access it. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Kirian. All of those great comments. Cycling in the this point about dividends. I also look at the paper that you recommended, if it's online, a working paper online. Antonio,
if you can put on the chat, everyone can access the paper, and our working paper is in the SOAS website, in economics working paper series, and the book on structural transformation is open access. So if anyone wants to download these materials, they're all free. Yes, I mean, Karen, this issue, this is something that, in fact, we are trying. The thing is that there are so many interesting things that could be done that is always, catching up against time. With Sophie and Fiona Tregenna, my friend, colleague, with whom we have done quite a bit of work on premature deindustrialization. And as you know, she has been one of the much earlier than Danny Roderick that people always refer to when they think about premature deindustrialization. There is a long Cambridge tradition which goes back to Bob Rothorn, Ajit Singh, Gabriel Palm, and others who have been looking at pattern of premature deindustrialization in the past. And in many respects, we're trying to figure out the extent to which, of course, terms of trade and other kind of relationship with the financial market will also potentially playing a role. In the case of South Africa, I think South Africa is a quite, it's extremely heterogeneous in terms of what you get on the manufacturing sector side, right? And so the aggregate figures always sort of tell us half of the story and can be sometimes a bit misleading. So I'll give you an example, right? So we've done, and we have a few papers on the automotive sector in South Africa, right? So the automotive sector, where you have the 7 OEMs, the 7 major, the BMW, the Mercedes, Volkswagen, the Toyota, and so on. Some of these are potentially among the most productive factories in terms of comparison with the BMW there and Mercedes were comparable in productivity, and the models they were doing were cutting edge models. You visit the plant, is exactly visiting one of their plants in Germany, okay, or in the US. Now, some of these companies, however, were FDI driven, of course, but they were companies which were strictly operating simply to plug into the domestic market, especially in a phase where the rising middle class was actually more than reinvesting in production, was actually expanding significantly the consumption possibilities. And if you discuss this with people in the government who have been trying to link their industrial policy to this FDI and trying to translate that FDI in more domestic investment, they will tell you, as probably they've already done, that actually in many cases there was lots of resistance also in transferring more manufacturing capacity in the country. The country is also in a quite, if you want, unfavorable position geographically, because if you compare, for example, Morocco with South Africa, you have a much more dynamic of reinvestment and less financialization there. Morocco at the moment produces 700,000 cars. South Africa is below the 500,000, which is a threshold to keep an automotive sector running. You have, first producer of pharma products and so on. So South Africa has, I think, lots of factors, I'm trying to say, probably contributed to the fact that the industrial policy were not successful in actually leveraging FDI that was coming in. It's never been sufficient. You're right, absolutely right. But sometimes it's not just the quantum, it's the way in which these resources were then embedded into domestic investment. The other example, South Africa was mentioning the mining equipment side. South Africa has a long tradition of exporting technology and mining equipment. So the Anglo-American, the Scandinavian, the big companies, international companies, have actually draw technological capabilities from the country. The fact that the country was not able to leverage its capabilities, and we have done a study of that specific on mining equipment, was because they didn't have a financial system that provided them financial products to package their own equipment and their own export of products. So we 2 years ago, we did a master plan for the master plan in mining equipment. We went to the government and we said, look, you are losing share in the key manufacturing, medium high-tech sector that you have. This is an entire cluster around the Gauteng region between Johannesburg and Pretoria. You are losing your competitive advantage in the region, in the continent. Yellow goods from China are coming. There are goods coming from all sorts of different places. What are you doing? Why is that your company are losing that competitiveness? And one of the things that came out among the many from the study was that lots of the international companies which were penetrating the market were able to provide mining houses with specific financial products, which means mainly leasing and other type of contracts, which were making lots of the products coming from other countries more competitive, were less advanced. Okay, so I can see the two causational mechanisms going from one direction to the other. Too much finance, not too much investment, little finance that serve productive activities, less capacity to be competitive. So I think these things in different sectoral value chain can be unpacked in different ways. And I'm very much with you in saying that there has to be more work to be done in terms of really understanding this nexus between premature deindustrialization and premature financialization. In South Africa is probably one of the best cases, unfortunately, for the country that we could pick up.
Thank you so much, Antonio, for the response. By the way, Kieran, I can see your hand is still up. Also, I did Google a working paper entitled "Dividend Policy and Payouts Dividends from South Africa." I'm not sure whether that's the paper that you are referring to, Kieran. If it is, then the link is on there for our participants to have a look. But if it is not, maybe you can send us a link later, Kieran, when you have time. Kieran, yeah.
Yeah, that's the link. That's the link. Yeah. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. I definitely read it, with pleasure. Since it is on dividend policy and payouts, I guess that it addresses the second question of the dividend conundrum, the dividend puzzle. Let me check again to see whether there are any comments, observations from the audience. But let me also say that Antonio kindly shared a copy of the paper with all of us. It was in the invitation email from Athena. And so I guess that after whetting your appetite with the presentation and then the discussion, if you read the paper, you can circle back the comments directly to Antonio and Sophie, as this is work in progress. But absolutely, exciting with three important, case studies that I hadn't come across before.
Victor, just to clarify, it's not just the two of us, it's also Nishal Robb, who is in the audience as well.
Oh, yes, Nishal, thank you very much. Yeah, Antonio, yeah, and that's exactly, in the paper. And I can see also it will be of interest to quite a number of people here, especially I can see colleagues from the African Development Bank, South African office, regional office, who also tend to look at this, but I guess that they'll have more time to read. And let me encourage them to directly, send their comments to, Antonio. And also, as we do in the Center for Global Finance, this seminar will be available in YouTube, in our channel, and Asina is going to be sending you the link. Asina and Meng will be sending you the link at the YouTube channel so that you can again listen to us and then feedback. Okay, so let me see. Before I conclude, let me say once again what I said at the beginning, in case you're not around, that this is the last seminar this academic year, because actually our end of term is Friday this week. And then we'll open again on the 25th of September. And so these seminars on Wednesday, so the first seminar will be on Wednesday, the 25th of September. I know the paper that I will be speaking, about, which is my ongoing work on climate risk and company financial, behavior. It's a global sample, and it is also quasi-experimental in terms of looking at the levers that policymakers are using for climate change and see the impact they can make using differences. Okay. And also next academic year, that is 23-24, these seminars will be hybrid. So we'll again be those around London will be meeting for a little bit of coffee, and then those around the globe, including those presenters, also can be able to get us online. Let me also add that I would like to invite participants to send us their ongoing research so that we can then program for the research seminars next year. And indeed, when I look through the names of people here, quite a number of people have been speakers on this forum, and will continue to do so for next academic year. I think Sina has shared the YouTube in the chat. So maybe I should give Antonio before we give him applause with the two co-authors. Let me, if you have any parting shots, any parting shots for us. Yeah.
Thank you, Victor. No, thanks so much for the comments. It's extremely helpful, and I'm pleased that we had this opportunity to discuss this topic and look forward to continue the conversation. Let me just say that the joint initiative that Economics Department and the School of Finance and Management have annually, which is our Penrose lecture, that this year is going to be given by Professor William Lazonic, which of course has been working on these issues for many years. So it's going to be, Victor, if I'm not wrong, in October. So for those who are interested specifically in this topic, I think would be great for you to just already put a signpost in your agenda. We will have Professor Lazonic live here from SOAS, but of course we will be streaming also the lectures. So I'd like to finish with that invitation and thanking Atina for all the organization, and Victor again for chairing and for inviting me here.
Thank you very much, Antonio. And let's put our hands together and give you a hand of applause, and also a hand of applause to you participants for being able to join in this discussion. Thank you indeed, and bye-bye.